Today we're going to hear from Prisca again. And it begins like this. Hey, ya! You, woman, stop! I had just stepped out of Titius's house into a blinding noonday sunlight. My eyes were adjusting. I couldn't see the man who screamed, though I thought I knew the voice. He seemed enraged. Stop, he screamed. Wife of Aquila, Jew from Pontus, I have something to say to you. He meant me. I stopped. I shaded my eyes and strained to find him, but it only made my vision swim in tears. People filled the sunny street, passing to and fro. Carts moved slowly behind their oxen, wheels grinding the deep grooves of the pavement. Yes, you, walking with your outstretched neck, you, mincing forward on tinkling feet. I blinked the water away. There he was, coming along the street wall of the synagogue. Sosthenes, the head of the synagogue himself, shuffling sideways, one eye on me, his face askance like a four-legged beast. Whore, he screamed. I turned to knock on Titius's door, but who would hear me in time? I turned again and hiked the hem of my robe and started across the street, calling over my shoulder, we have nothing to do with each other. Sosthenes broke a brick from the wall that joined the synagogue to Titius's house, and suddenly I knew who had been throwing bricks at us when we worshipped. The synagogue sits on the north side of the Cenchraian Road, but its door and facade face east, straight at the western wall of the house of Titius Justus. While Titius attended the synagogue, this, his wall, was praised as protection. The space between was cultivated as a little Judea. The man himself was beloved for fencing this little Judea from the street by constructing a brick wall between the corners of the buildings, a beautiful gate in the middle. But then they banned Paul from the synagogue. Immediately, Titius the Gentile left as well, inviting the apostle to preach in his house. Next, marvelously, the head of the synagogue, Crispus, followed Paul to the house next door. For a while, he worshipped in both places, but people blamed him for limping between two opinions. They begged him to abandon Paul. He wouldn't, so he too was clean cut off. That caused a wondrous bleeding. Gentiles began to flow from the congregation of the Jews to churches in the houses of other Gentiles. Titius Justus, Erastus, Gaius. There had to emerge, a new head for the synagogue. But this was a man of angers, Sosthenes, swearing he'd heal this wound to their membership. He couldn't. He didn't. And maybe the failure drove him crazy. Lately, someone had been throwing bricks at Titius's house while we were worshiping inside. I always assumed it was children, till now, seeing Sosthenes break that brick from the wall and come at me. Whore, he cried, whore, and worse than a whore, adulteress. I quickened my pace. I leaped the sewage in the middle of the street. It was noonday, bright and busy. I had to weave through scores of people, but no one would pay attention. I have nothing to do with you, I cried. You have nothing to do with me. You're the woman, Sosthenes screamed, who forsook the companion of her youth. You've forgotten the covenant of your God. Your path leads down to death. I was running westward toward the Julian Basilica, toward the marketplace. I ran like a slave, my bare legs flying free. Suddenly, right behind me, the man barked, "The blood in you!" I shrieked and shot forward. But he grabbed my tunic, yanked it, spun me around. "The blood in you is Jewish," he yelled, driving me down to my knees, "even if your heart is not." Sosthenes, His face inflamed, his hair a horror of knots, lifted the brick above me. "Bad enough that you stand among the men when they pray," he screamed. "But you, I have heard what else you do." The brick grew huge in the sunlight. I felt a wild tingling in my scalp where it would hit and split the skin. I threw up my arms. Sosthenes caught both my wrists in his right hand and twisted them. I cried out. "With my own ears," he hissed, bending me backward before him, "I've heard you disgrace the nation." He was directly above me, black as a storm. The rough pavement was cutting my knees. Sosthenes hissed, "I have heard you pray, woman. Pray out loud. Pray among the men. Through the open windows, I've heard you utter instruction to men as if your authority were greater than theirs. Oh, woman." He rose up, and the brick rose higher to hit with a harder fall. I dropped my head between my shoulders. Sosthenes began to whip me left and right from the wrists, screaming, "Show your face! Show your shameful face!" Then he said, "Oof!" Somewhere in the spaces above me, Sosthenes said, "Oof," and released me. I collapsed. At the same time, I heard the round thump of a good-sized body hitting the ground. Not mine. A lovely fragrance enveloped me then, the scent of clean flesh. Strong arms slipped beneath my back and my knees, and I was lifted lightly into the air, lifted as if I were a baby, and like a baby, I started to cry. "But I cover my head," I said. The man who held me said, "What?" "I never prophesy," I kept sobbing, "without covering my head." "Well, of course not," he said. "Now, where do you want us to take you?" I looked. I saw Sosthenes sitting in sewage, his legs stuck out like take handles, his mouth wide open, striving for air, his face as purple as the seed of Solomon. The brick was still in his left hand, forgotten, but his eyes were not oblivious. He saw the people passing by. He saw their expressions. He saw the good man holding me. "Where do you want us to take you?" My savior was black, a Nubian. "I can walk," I said, but I sobbed while I said it. "I can walk home," I said. "Of course you can, but my mistress would never hear of it." "Mistress?" "There, awaiting you, see?" I looked and saw a woman smiling at me through the parted curtains of an expensive litter. 7 strong men, all the same height, all dressed in the same red livery, stood by the long poles that bore the beautiful box. The man who carried me also wore red. "She heard your cries," he said, striding toward the litter. "She sent me to knock courtesy into that round fool on the ground, and she now begs your company." Indeed, the woman who pulled the curtains wide apart so that the Nubian could hand me into her compartment and set me beside her on pillows. "Ah, my poor dear," she said, receiving me. She had a delicate laugh lines at the corners of her eyes, lines of smiling around her mouth, a prominent cheekbone. As they closed the curtain, she offered me a shining linen cloth. I stared at it, at the tiny weave of the piece. "For your tears, my dear," she said, "to wipe them." But I couldn't take it, couldn't soil it. So the woman leaned forward herself, braced my neck in the crook of her wrist, and dabbed my eyes with the cloth. A child. I was not but a child that day, brought down by an angry man, raised up by a slave, and delivered into the care of a woman I'd never met before. An angel, I think, whom I loved immediately. "What shall I call you?" she said. She had gray eyes. Her voice was like doves. She cooed. "Prisca," I said. "Well then, Prisca," she said. moistening the linen with saliva and cleaning the cuts on my knees. "Call me Phoebe. I live in Cenchreae, but I'll take you to your house before I go to mine." I can walk," I said, though I confess I was melting under the woman's touch. "Where do you live?" she said. And I said, "In the North Market." She cracked the curtains. Sunlight fell inside. "Marcus," she called, "carry us to the North Market. Oh, and pull that poor man from the middle of the street. It's indecent to leave him there." Well, and if I was fast to love Phoebe, she was equally quick to love Aquila. Already that afternoon she took him to be a man both grave and wise, she in whose manner I saw gravity, wisdom, and grace, all three. Actually, my husband's sobriety comes as much from physical caution as from mental deliberations. He's frightfully nearsighted, you know, but who am I to ruin impressions? On that first day of our meeting, Phoebe spent the entire afternoon with us in the shop. When I told Aquila the tale of my attack, she heard of Sosthenes in the synagogue, and it caused her to ask questions. Why was the man so antagonistic toward us? Aquila answered. He was genuinely grateful for the woman's intervention. He was moved, too, I think, by her interest, her civility, her listening. For nobility had come to our humble shop. Aquila answered yes, and with a deeper feeling than I'd heard before. His answer brought more questions, but why did we leave the synagogue in the first place? Why would those nearest us hate us the most? How could we maintain this particular joy, as she called it, in the face of human abuse? And whom, she asked, did we worship in the house next door? Aquila then began to talk about Jesus. As slowly as the motion of the sun, he described the righteous life of our Lord, while the gray-eyed woman peered at him and listened, drinking in his words like water. He described the awful suffering that Jesus sustained and the death he died for human sin, so that those who believe in him might be freed from sin and made as righteous as Christ himself before God our Father. I cooked a great pot of porridge, enough for everyone. Timothy came in, and neither of us said a word. What was happening here in our little shop was purely a wonder to both of us. Silently, we served the slaves outside the door, both porridge and a mulled wine, and we listened, all of us. In twilight, Aquila declared that on the third day Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. Death, therefore, had lost its power over us, and nothing could grieve us any more. No, nothing could kill us, as once we might have been killed. That, said Aquila, my sober husband, solemn in tone and doleful in aspect, that is the reason for our joy. Joy, said the man, nodding like a donkey at a funeral. He said joy, and I, standing in the doorway, lost control. I glanced at Timothy, the same delight in his bright eye, and both of us burst out laughing. Lady Phoebe looked at me with a half smile, questioning. Timothy couldn't help it either. Giggles crinkled the young man's face, and then he gave up and threw back his head and roared. "Oh, Aquila," I cried. "His joys are never frivolous, never giddy, seldom productive of smiles. Joy in such massive solemnity strikes me as silly." "Oh, Aquila," I cried, "you are so wonderful." "Yes," said Phoebe, "you are, sir, a wonderful preacher." And I loved this woman from Cenchreae more and more, for she had listened precisely and defined the pure wonder that had moved both me and Timothy before. My silent husband, wordless Aquila, had spoken. Indeed, he had preached, indeed, and the Spirit of God was upon us. Phoebe said, "I will come back tomorrow. You must show me more of this joy tomorrow." Then we three, after she left, sang hymns together. We sang till the lamps died out and the city was dark and the fires on the Acrocorinth began to collapse in their ashes.